All right. Welcome on behalf of the Chapel Hill Alliance for a Livable Town. I am Sheila Kreth. We hope that this will provide an opportunity for us to learn more about tiny homes, to learn some facts, to learn about the people who benefit from the opportunity for a tiny home, and to begin a conversation more broadly. We will hold all of your questions until the end, except after April Kemper's presentation. We will take a few minutes for your questions if it relates to clarification. But as you will see from your agenda, we do have a 25-minute Q&A period, so you'll have a lot of opportunity to voice your questions, to your opinions, to talk with each other as well as to the people who are giving presentations. So with that, I'd like to introduce Susan Levy, the Executive Director of Orange County Habitat. Probably most of you in the room know Susan or have gotten letters from Susan, hopefully saying thank you for your contribution. She is also chair of the Orange County Affordable Housing Coalition. Susan?
Thank you. Thank you, Sheila. Really thrilled to see so many people out here interested in tiny homes and so many familiar faces. I was asked to do this because obviously I've been very involved with affordable housing for a very long number of years and care very deeply about the issue. And I think everybody here probably knows that we are facing an affordable housing crisis here in our local community, but also across the nation. And there are very many reasons for that, and I won't go into that because I only have 5 minutes. But in order to solve or even begin to approach the affordable housing crisis that we have, we've got to look at that problem from a lot of different angles and approach it with a lot of different solutions. And so I believe that tiny homes is one piece of a very complicated puzzle. And that the more options that we have, the more tools that we have to approach the affordable housing crisis, the more chance we have of actually having an impact. So I'm excited that we're looking at this as one of the options to address affordable housing in our community. I'm going to give you a couple of statistics just to sort of set the stage. And actually, the Affordable Housing Coalition is hosting a summit on Friday, and I think a lot of you are going to be there. And so this is cheating and taking some of the information from the information that we're going to give out at that larger summit. But these are just a few statistics to keep in mind. So over the last 5 years, rent costs here in Orange County have gone up 16%. And I'm not going to tell you all how much it costs to rent an average home, an average apartment here. I think a lot of you know it's well over $1,000. The average residential closing in Orange County in 2015, that's a couple years ago, was $342,000. That's in the county. It's much higher in Chapel Hill and Carborough. There's a housing gap of nearly 5,000 homes that are affordable to people living in Orange County who earn less than $20,000. So the next few statistics really relate to people at the bottom of the economic scale who are really the most impacted by this crisis. There are 0 units of any size affordable to households earning less than 30% of area median income. A third of county households are spending more than 30% of their income on housing. That's the definition of affordable. You shouldn't be spending more than 30% of your income for your housing costs. And we've got a third of people in our county, regardless of income, who are doing that. And 65% of residents who earn less than $50,000 their household are cost burdened. That means they're spending more than 30% of their income. So those are just a few of the statistics that point to the affordable housing crisis that I was talking about. So if tiny homes can be built affordably and we can get rid of the restrictions that might cause them to cost more than they should, then they should be a viable option for those folks most in need. And that would be our senior citizens, other folks living on fixed incomes, those transitioning out of homelessness, and I think you'll hear more from Lisa about that, and young people who are just starting out on their own. So I'm going to, at this point, introduce you to the panel that you're going to be hearing from. Oops. And I am going to have to read this because I want to get it right. April Kemper is our first speaker. She's a long-term resident of Chapel Hill who works at the university. And for years, she's been following the tiny home movement as affordable and a sustainable housing option. She co-leads the Chapel Hill Tiny Home Initiative. Reverend Lisa Fishback, I don't see her, but assuming she'll be here, she's the vicar of the Episcopal Church of the Advocate. She's a member of the board of Pee Wee Homes, which Habitat's actually helped to build one of those, a collaboration to provide affordable tiny homes for people who would otherwise be homeless. She's helped lead the development of the first Pee Wee Homes at the Church of the Advocate and in the Northside neighborhood, prototypes that can be scaled for other sites in our region and beyond. Laura Lavoie. Laura and her husband built and lived in a tiny home for years near Asheville and organized Asheville's Small Home Advisory Committee, or SHAC. SHAC helped the city of Asheville put small home options in the city's development code. Laura wasn't able to make it this evening, so Kimberly Brewer is going to be sharing their message of successes, challenges, and lessons learned. Kimberly is a resident of Chapel Hill and a professional environmental planner and co-leads the Chapel Hill Tiny Home Initiative. And we have Nathan Huning. He's been a Chapel Hill resident since 2003 and has been involved with the local business community, both as an entrepreneur and a technology consultant. In 2012, he served as a Chapel Hill 2020 facilitator for diversity in the arts. Nathan and his wife, Callie Broyle, get it right, with the Keenan Flagler Business School. They both began building a 200-square-foot movable tiny home in 2015, and they live full-time in it in Orange County. And then finally, we have Bethany Cheney, a longtime affordable housing friend. She's the town of Carrboro alderman and the past chair of its affordable housing task force. She's a local tiny home pioneer, living in her tiny home in Carrboro since 2011. Bethany has an MBA and is a nonprofit consultant who works with clients in the community economic development industry, including affordable housing. Turn it over to
Thank you, Susan. Welcome, everyone. I'm really, really happy to be here and happy to see all you. I really want to thank CHALT for sponsoring this and making this whole evening possible. Especially want to thank my partner, Kimberly Brewer, who is owner of this Chapel Hill Tiny Home Initiative. Without you, honey, a lot of this would not be happening, so I really appreciate you lending your gifts and talents to make this happen. So what I want to talk about today is obviously tiny homes. And when we think about tiny homes, I want to try to show you how they can be an affordable, sustainable option in our community, and kind of go through the people who are choosing to live tiny, some of the barriers right now that are preventing people from living tiny, and what some communities are doing to prevent those barriers or overcome them. So when we think about tiny homes, I'm going to be talking about movable tiny homes and tiny homes that are on foundations. So first, the true definition of a tiny home is a home that has living areas of up to 400 square feet. Most tiny homes are anywhere between 170 to 320 square feet. And when you think about a movable tiny home, those homes are designed in a way that they're no more than 8 feet wide or 13.6 high, so that they can traverse the highways without having a special permit. And most of these houses are moved with a standard truck. So what are some of the benefits of allowing tiny homes in our community? Well, the first is definitely affordability. And we'll look at the numbers in a minute. But tiny homes are affordable, they're sustainable, they're easy to locate, hook up to utilities, and maintain. And if you allow them as a backyard cottage, especially for affordable housing, they require no taxpayer subsidy. So let's look at the affordability numbers. So say you were going to build or purchase a tiny home here in Chapel Hill compared to building or purchasing a traditional home. Well, that tiny home can cost anywhere between $17,000 and $95,000. And a $95,000 tiny home is a nice tiny home, believe me. But let's look at the median home value in Chapel Hill, $362,000. Closing sales price last year, $442,000. That is not affordable. Many people in our community cannot spend $362,000 for a house. And if they can buy a house for $80,000, That's going to be affordable. If we think about a tiny home that we allow to stay on the trailer and is movable, here's some fees that also could be eliminated for that tiny home owner. Land purchase. Land is very expensive in Chapel Hill. Inspection fees, hookup fees, all of these things could make the tiny home much more affordable. So what makes them more costly and difficult to permit? So number one is the building code. The current building code is set for a traditional house. It's not set for a tiny house. So many tiny house homeowners use the loft to sleep in. They access the loft with stairs or a ladder. That is prohibitive with the current building code. You cannot sleep in your loft. And when you're thinking about movable tiny homes, the current building code does not allow them at all. You have to build that tiny home on a foundation. The other barrier is development codes. So we all know that all the land in Chapel Hill and Orange County is zoned some designation. And so there is no allowable zoning for a movable tiny home in the county or in Chapel Hill. And then if you also look at some of the developmental code restrictions like minimum lot size or requiring additional off-street parking, this can also add more cost to the tiny home. And the worst thing you can do for a tiny home is define it as a conventional RV, because legally you cannot live in your RV for more than 180 consecutive days. So who are the people, despite all the barriers, still wanting to go tiny? So what I would like to do is show you that 2 out of 5 tiny homeowners are over 50. More women own tiny homes than men. And if you look at mortgages, 70% of tiny homeowners have no mortgage compared to 29% of traditional homeowners. That is affordable housing. Also, not surprising, millennials make up the fastest growing segment of our population wanting to go tiny. As we all know, millennials come out of college with a lot of debt, and so they really cannot afford homes. So I'm going to start with, there's some small, short videos where people are going to tell you exactly why they want to go tiny. As you see, Brittany is a first grade school teacher, and this is the person that we keep saying we want to live in our town. And you know, for $35,000, we could have some teachers living here. And luckily for Brittany, she's able to live in her school district. This is Jewel Pearson. She lives down in Charlotte. She's a corporate executive, single mom, now empty nester, who had this tiny house built. This was also featured on HGTV. Peter and Nicole. Peter is here tonight. This is his tiny house that he built here in Orange County. It's now complete, and he and his wife are going to live outside of Raleigh. Nathan and Callie, you'll hear from them later. They're on the panel, but this is their tiny home that they built and that they're living in right now here in Orange County. So one of the questions Kimberly and I constantly got was, is tiny homes, or are they just going to be student housing? Well, if you look at this table here, the 11 criteria where the students, when they were asked in their housing wants, we only could find 2 out of those 11 criteria that a tiny house would meet. So we don't really think this is going to be just more student housing. So what are some of the code amendments that are required for tiny homes? Well, one thing, the first would be to define the tiny house, to establish design criteria, and establish building code standards. So again, the definition of a tiny house is a dwelling that is 400 square feet or less, excluding the loft. And if we look at the definition of Fresno, now Fresno is the first city to allow movable tiny homes as backyard cottages. And the tiny house must meet these 6 conditions in Fresno. It must be licensed and registered with the state of California and meet ANSI standards. It must be towable by a bumper hitch, cannot move on its own power. And when seated on the parcel, the wheels and the carriage must be skirted and obscured from view. It can be no larger than a vehicle allowed to travel on the California state highways, has to have at least 100 square feet of first floor living space. It must be self-contained to support all the normal daily routines of living, and it must be designed and built to look like a conventional building structure. And Fresno's goes on to say that the house has to resemble architecturally the main house on the property. So as we can see, tiny homes do not fit neatly within the 3 existing building codes. We have ANSI for RVs, HUD for mobile homes, and the IRC for traditional stick building. We need a new, consistent way to certify tiny homes. As of this year, Appendix Q is now part of the International Residential Code. What Appendix Q does is it addresses the tiny house interiorly. So now you can have a loft and you can have a ladder to access the loft. It makes the interior space much more usable. So state and local governments can apply to the state can apply to adopt Appendix Q so that we can actually apply it to tiny homes. These homes are inspected and permanent just like a stick-built house. And the thing is that Appendix Q only addresses the tiny house, not the wheels or the trailer. So for movable tiny homes, there's 2 ways to certify them. You can do ANSI or REVA, like Fresno did, and there's also NOAA, which stands for the National Organization of Alternative Housing. NOAA is a newer entity. So now let's move on to communities that are removing barriers to movable tiny homes. We've already talked about Fresno. One, I'd like to point your attention to Burnsville, Minnesota, because right now they have a draft ordinance under review to allow movable tiny homes in R3 zoning, which includes mobile home parks. Ojai, LA, and Ventura will hopefully go the way of Fresno. They have draft ordinance under review currently. And Flat Rock, North Carolina uses RV park designation to have movable tiny homes. We'll talk about what's going on in Flat Rock in a minute. So communities that are removing barriers to tiny homes on foundations. Kimberly will talk more about what's going on in Nashville. I want to tell you what's happening over in Greensboro. They have reduced setbacks and parking requirements for tiny home communities and are currently evaluating other code changes needed. Maine, Georgia, and Idaho have all adopted Appendix Q and are allowing tiny homes on foundations. So what are some projects in our community? Lisa Fishback will talk more about the Pee Wee homes, but essentially these are 3 tiny homes built on foundations on the Church of the Advocate land. They are supported by the town of Chapel Hill, and they're scheduled to cost roughly between $40,000 and $45,000 each, and they're about 280 square feet. The duplex in Northside is now complete. This was in collaboration with Self-Help Credit Union, Pee Wee Homes, Habitat, and the town of Chapel Hill. The duplexes sit on 0.07 acre, and they're about 320 square feet each. Again, they're built to the standard building code, and they cost about $48,000 each to build. Projects around our state. Chatham County, the farm at Penny Lane. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this, but there's one tiny house there on a foundation, again, to the standard building code, and they hope to build 9 more. This is for people with mental illness. Tiny House Greensboro is the nonprofit I spoke about earlier. On half an acre, they're going to build 6 tiny homes, all on foundations, and the tiny homes are estimated to cost roughly $15,000. Village of Wildflowers. So this is what's going on in Flat Rock. Kimberly and I were able to visit this community. It's really amazing. It was a former mobile home park, and the county went to the state to get an exemption from the building code to allow park model housing on foundations as well as tiny houses. It sits on 27 acres, and it has a village hall, community kitchen, fitness center. It's a really, really beautiful property. Here are the tiny houses. We were able to talk to a woman who's living in a tiny house here who had just moved from Texas and is really, really happy in this development. Over in Austin, Texas, Community First Village. This is also sitting on 27 acres. It has tiny homes on foundations. And this is for people transitioning out of homelessness. This is an amazing community. On site, it has a health clinic, a community market, worship facilities, and many of the residents work for the community and are paid a living wage. So, how can tiny homes fit into our affordable housing equation? Well, I think we've talked about some different areas that they could be as backyard cottages, cluster communities on town, university, or private land, or a combination of all three. Homes like faith-based community, like the Church of the Advocate. Habitat projects like we have the duplex at Northside. Maybe we could have a mobile home park refitted to be like a village of wildflowers. I mean, really, the options are pretty endless. I want to also draw attention to our petition. Kimberly and I, many of you have signed it, and we really appreciate that. The petition will be delivered to the town council this Wednesday. We asked the council to do three things: evaluate code revisions adopted or being considered by other communities, amend the town's codes to make tiny homes a legal and affordable housing option, and to adopt the IRC Appendix Q for tiny homes. Thank you so much. And here's some more information. Any clarification? Yes. Yes. Yeah, I mean, a true tiny house is no more than 400 square feet. Yeah. If you're building on a foundation, you can obviously make it bigger, but if you want to be able to move it, it can't be bigger than 400 square feet. Well, thank you. Yeah, so can we have the panel please come up? Also, while they're coming up, I want to draw your attention. There's a Tiny House Street Festival in North Carolina. The first one was last year. It's in Pink Hill. I have some flyers up here, and it's happening again this year. So if you want to, go and see some different tiny homes and talk to people who are living and building them, please join us in April down at Pink Hill, North Carolina.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? I just want to say that I got news that Reverend Fishback had an emergency. And so this is what happens when you're a reverend. And so she will not be able to make it tonight. But I'd like to, what we asked her to address was a couple of questions. And I'll try to, can you hear me okay? Okay, can you hear me now? Whoa, okay. All right, there we go. So for those who didn't hear, Reverend Fishback won't be able to make it. She had an emergency, and we just learned that. I asked her to address a couple of questions. What did she see as the opportunities for homes like Pee Wee Homes to really help fill affordable housing needs in our community? And I also asked her to share her experience with Pee Wee Homes in terms of the kinds of barriers that they had to overcome in building those homes, both at the Church of the Advocate and the North Side. So I will hope that there's some folks who were involved in the Pee Wee Homes to help share some of their ideas about how they can spread through our community. I do know a few of the barriers that they had to overcome, so I can share some of those with you tonight. For the Church of the Advocate, April shared the three really beautiful tiny homes, about 320 square feet each. And unfortunately, they didn't fit into any zoning category in our town. And so they had to be regulated as a commercial property. And so commercial properties have sidewalk requirements and parking requirements and fire prevention requirements and a lot of expensive requirements that this small tiny community had to meet. And so that added cost. To it. Originally, they were told that they were going to have one a water and sewer hookup for each one of those tiny homes for $3,600 each. That's a lot of money for a small home. And so I think, as I understand it, it's been reduced to them being able to share one hookup, and the fees. WASA has significantly reduced fees for smaller homes, so that's very good news. in terms of the North Side neighborhood, I want to just give a shout out to the town for having a wonderful affordable housing bonus, a 15% bonus. So that really tiny 0.07 acre that April mentioned that the duplex was able to be built on was able to have a nice size tiny home duplex because of that affordable housing bonus. But the building code really constrained the space inside in terms of being able to use the space inside that tiny home. For example, you have a really nice high-pitched roof, but you can't use that as a loft at all. And so you can only use the ground floor. So those are just some of the barriers to making those houses more livable, more accessible, more affordable. And that's for nonprofits trying to build them. So we hope that Reverend Fishback weathers her emergency, and I apologize that I had to cover for her, but I'm hoping that during questions and answers of those who were involved in that wonderful coalition partnership at Northside and Pee Wee Church of the Advocate, if you can speak up and share more information. And now I'm going to put on my hat for Laura Lavoie. And this is, you're going to hear me way too much tonight. So Laura is so sorry she wasn't able to make it tonight. But I was able to interview Laura and Christo Moorhead, both with SHAC. And they were so generous with their time. They really shared a lot of information so I can share their story of what's happening in Asheville. Since the 1960s, the main kind of housing that's been built in Asheville has been large, single-family, expensive housing. And more recently, they've also added a new type, mid-rise condos and apartments that are expensive. And there's been no diversity in between. And so for the last several years, the city has really been working on grappling with what it calls the missing middle. And it reached out to SHAC, again, the Small Housing Advisory Committee, to help it bring back the sort of the small homes that have been part of the history of Asheville and part of its fabric in the city. And within 6 months, they adopted an accessory dwelling unit ordinance that allows backyard cottages. There's no minimum size. They have to be on a foundation and meet the building code. This sounds familiar for those of you in Chapel Hill, Carrboro, and Orange County. That's what we have right now in our community. But the interesting thing was that they went on. And in the next 18 months, they worked hard to make those accessory dwelling units more affordable, more accessible, and more feasible. So I wanted to go over specifically the code changes that they adopted late last summer that made such a difference to the small home community advocates. First of all, for all residential districts, they reduced the lot width, the driveway width, and the setback requirements. And the reason this was important, they did this to really allow the larger lots in the city to be subdivided more easily and to be accessed more easily and to provide more flexibility to developers and homeowners wanting to do accessory dwellings. And then for multifamily districts, they did something very interesting. They increased the number of units or accessory dwelling units the larger the lot. So for every 1,000 square foot of lot that you have over the minimum square foot requirement, you get an additional unit. So if you have 3,000 additional square feet, you get 3 additional units. And the interesting thing was they said, well, you can own that as one individual or you can treat those as condos. So again, trying to provide some flexibility. And finally, as April said, design standards are important, so they didn't forget that. They adopted neighborhood design standards for these accessory dwelling units. Now I ask Laura and Christo, we have this on paper now. What's the challenge to really getting some real small homes and tiny homes on the ground? Again, these were for tiny homes on foundations. That's what they were focusing on. And they said there were several challenges, as you can imagine. First, for the cluster tiny homes, they said that the challenge there was the cost of water and sewer construction and hookup, the parking requirements, and just the land prices in the city of Asheville. All those things conspired to make it still difficult. Not impossible, but still difficult. Also, they said adopting the new IRC Appendix Q, as April said, that became effective last month at the national level. Now states have to adopt it. The state of North Carolina has a very tough building code council, and they are showing some resistance to adopting Appendix Q. And so they said, just individuals going to the state or one community going to the state may not be very effective. It may take a number of local governments petitioning the State Building Code Council for adoption of this Appendix Q. As April said, Appendix Q is for tiny homes on foundations. So what about movable tiny homes? Both Laura and Christo thought that, they really agreed with April and that we need new, consistent certification standards at the local level. They need to be adopted and approved by the local governments in a way that provides safety and consistency for tiny homes, both for the user of the tiny home and for the citizens and the local government. It may take a while to get that kind of locally adopted certification process in place, like ANSI or NOAA, the ones that April mentioned. And so they said in the near term, maybe a good answer is to extend the amount of time that you can stay in an RV or a park model. Remember, that's what they did in the Village of Wildflowers that April showed you. And so you can live year-round there in a park model or a tiny home on wheels, a tiny home on a foundation or a tiny home on wheels. And so that could be something, maybe we could change our codes to extend the time allowable in those types of units. Given the land prices in Asheville, and we're probably pretty similar in Chapel Hill and Carrboro, they think that the tiny home communities will likely be in the rural county area surrounding the city limits, just because the land prices are so sort of driving the incentive for maximizing profits in the city. And so they see that as a trend, and several tiny home communities have just opened in the last couple of years in counties just around Asheville, and they think that that's probably what will continue to happen in the near term. So that's their story of what's happening in Asheville.
Well, our story is that we just love living in our little house, and I'm sort of bummed that someday we'll have to move into a larger space. It's sort of, there's the way I wanted to structure my remarks is just briefly sort of like from a personal perspective what led us to do it, but then in a larger perspective of what it means as far as like a community standpoint versus just like a personal standpoint. And for us, it's not unlike any of the, in like an April slide, the millennials are trying to get somewhere else. Okay.
That's okay. Just go ahead.
Just go ahead.
Yeah.
Talking to her.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah. Okay. No, okay, good. Okay. Well, so we there's a script that any sort of young person follows. You graduate from college with however many tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debt, and then maybe there's jobs, maybe there aren't jobs, and then the expectation is that you will then borrow several more tens of thousands of dollars to buy something that costs many more hundreds of thousands of dollars that you'll spend the next 30 years paying for, and that's a real bummer. And so the idea is, if housing is such a large proportion of one's income, then it just reduces the sort of the flexibility that you have. And so for us, it was, well, we can either get rich or we can reduce our expenses in order to live like a rich and full life. And so the idea was, we just started researching and went to a lot of workshops and things and started building in 2015. And we moved in about a year ago, and we've been living maybe 18 months. And, like our housing cost is basically down to zero. So we just pay a small lot fee where we're staying at an undisclosed location in Orange County. But there's a septic tank and well, so we don't pay for that. We pay a modest electric fee, a modest gas fee. And so all of the income that we make that would have gone to that can now be for we can either save more or we can work less, which is sort of the goal, and maybe volunteer more, or we can try to do things that are more fulfilling for us that aren't necessarily just chasing a paycheck all the time. And so we're relatively privileged in that we are college educated, we have pretty good jobs, but there's plenty of folks who don't have those options. So it's as hard as it's been for us, it would only be that much harder for the populations that would really benefit from a tiny house. So it sounds trivial, but ours was sort of like a financial reason. But more than that is, the way that we have our communities is, we tell people how much a tiny house can cost. Like a $95,000 tiny house you think is just bananas, but for 200 square feet or something. But what happens is there's an incentive to just keep building bigger and bigger. And so to just enclose empty space doesn't cost much. So if you've already done all the hard work of getting the house together, if you want to add that third bedroom or that fourth bedroom, you're just talking like some 2x4s and wiring to enclose that extra bedroom, maybe $5,000 worth of materials, but you as a builder can sell it for another $50,000 or however much larger. So some of these houses are getting larger and larger and larger, and I'm not sure that's really great for anybody as far as how it impacts the neighborhoods that we live in, or even the space that we have within to sort of interact and live in a community life. So it's both in a personal standpoint, we thought it was important, but then also from this larger standpoint of how we build our communities, how we live, and our sort of carbon impact is that we thought it was a worthy endeavor.
Thanks. Nathan, it's fun to hear your story. Nathan got in touch with me when they were ready to site their house, and I'd hoped to be in Carborough, and I had to tell him that he wouldn't be able to be in Carborough for a variety of reasons. And Amelia, who's here, I think has figured out how to be, but regardless, we understand that there are really huge barriers, and I'm really grateful for y'all today for pulling us together to talk about this. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the cost of my house and, why I did it, what kind of space was necessary for it, and how does it compare to other kinds of living. And so my house was one of those higher cost houses. I am on a foundation. The footprint of my house is 440 square feet, but that includes a deck for taxation purposes. So if you take the deck off, it's less than 400 square feet. I do have a loft, and I'm not ashamed to say that I live in it. But I also have a bedroom, which is how I passed inspection. And that house, to build the house, the development budget of the house was about $90,000. We'll call it that. That's at least what I told the bank. And about 10% of that was an impact fee. If you're going to build that house today, it's not going to cost you $90,000. It's going to cost you a whole lot less, and that's as it should be. I paid more than the 2,500 square foot house that's across the way from me, because impact fees had scaled at the time that I built my house. In addition, I had tap fees and water sewer line that I had to cut. And all of those things you have to pay for, as essentially you already have added to your development costs before you've built anything. And so in some respects, I think it's fair to say that it's not very affordable per square foot to build a small house like mine. But there are lots of other reasons why it's a good option for some folks. I built that house. At the end of the day, I should also say that was the development cost of the house. I paid a whole lot more than $90,000 for a half-acre piece of property. And that half acre could support many more homes than just mine. But in Carborough, it would not be allowed, and the covenants on my lot wouldn't have allowed it either. But I did it anyway, and I did it because I wanted to. I did it because to build a bigger house would require a second income, and I didn't have a second income, and I didn't have a spouse or a partner to support me in that way. And I still wanted to live on my own piece of property, and I wanted plenty of outdoors, and I wanted to be near downtown Carborough, and this is what I could afford to do on an income as a small business owner that fluctuates year to year. I couldn't afford to tap myself out. I needed something that I could manage whether my income was down or whether it was up in a given year. So that's why I did it for the most part. I also am a small person, so why should I live big, right? And I'm serious about that. And then finally, having a small footprint just made sense. It made sense ecologically. It made sense for all kinds of reasons. And if I could do it, and I was privileged in that way, I was going to try to figure out how to do it. But I want to read you something that I wrote after I moved into the house that I think kind of helps me keep perspective on that tiny house. Most of my friends live in average 4-bedroom, 2 and 1/2 bath homes with an extra den and good resale value, at least when market conditions are good. Theirs were practical decisions made in anticipation of growing families, relatively flat income, or at the very least, a modest return on investment. Their choices weren't arrogant, unhealthy, or environmentally unsound, although if pressed, they might admit they lived the way they thought they never would, like their parents. There are those among my friends who, while calculating the difference between their spaces and mine, controlling for height, girth, family size, and seasonal conditions, sigh wistfully. They let their eyes roam from floor to ceiling, along the lines of the loft, and through the galley kitchen to the small bedroom in the rear, taking in the whole house without ever moving their feet. It would be really nice to downsize, they say. Easy to clean. Then I tell them about my electric bills, which are less than $30 a month. Their shoulders shake with laughter and their chins move from side to side. So while it may have been a timely subject, when a columnist for the newspaper asked to write a story about my house, I demurred. Strangers would learn my address and seek out the house, disturbing the neighbors with whom I share a drive. They'd upset a delicate balance between my modesty and my pride. And I certainly was not interested in being a poster child for small living or for single women with cats and chronically low self-esteem. There are plenty of people who live in small spaces and plenty of small spaces to live in. There are studio apartments in Manhattan and 2-room mill houses in towns like mine. People live in barns and sheds, yurts and teepees, and plenty of souped-up camper vans. Some people choose their spaces gratefully, others experimentally. Then there are the highly principled who seek only to live sustainably, to reduce their footprint on the earth. Net zero waste, that sort of thing. Others have little choice in the matter, like those who live in tin-covered shanties, truck beds, and Katrina trailers, or prison cells. People live in cheap hotel rooms, flop houses, and cars, whole families in converted school buses. Once on my regular jogging path, and this was in Chapel Hill, I saw a returned soldier living camp-style beneath the trusses of a bridge. None of this is experimental living, really. It is rarely chosen on principle. If a newspaper published a story about these small homes, the message would have been quite different than the one they would publish about mine. I think about how we experiment with this idea of what tiny living is and tiny homes, and I think we're kind of messing with the wrong idea. It's not that they're small. It's that everybody needs to live in a way that is dignified and that allows them just what they need. And what I need may be very different than what Callie needs and may be very different than Michael Parker. But we need that kind of diversity and enabling environment in which every person can feel like they belong in our communities and they can live affordably because they can, and not because their only option is that park bench or those bridge trusses. So I'm pleased with myself and my house, but I'm also very humble about it all. Right? And I think everyone in this room should be about the way that they live. And I very much appreciate that y'all are begging the question, why can't more people live the way that Nathan and Callie do? Why can't more people be in tiny homes that the Church of the Advocate wants to build? Why can't more people live like me if they can afford it? We need housing diversity in our communities. So I would say there are 3 challenges that people have raised. I think the obvious ones are things like parking and zoning and land cost, right? But in addition to that, I would say that financing is probably actually the number one thing. You saw a lot of those people on those videos say, my mom helped me build this house. Yeah. You know, you've paid yours off, and that's really good. But it is still hard for people where if they're going to build on a movable platform or whether they're going to build on a foundation. A bank looks at tiny houses. Banks don't like them. for a lot of reasons. And the people that can afford to build them own their land outright or have some other piece of equity that they can leverage in order to build them. And not everybody has that available to them. Most banks won't finance a new home unless it is 1,000 square feet or more. And I mean in terms of construction, right? And then I would also say that NIMBYism is another problem. And by NIMBY, I mean people get really upset about anything that might affect their property value, right? Doesn't matter if they love the concept, doesn't matter if they love the idea of it, that they think that it's a noble cause. But the minute that your property value is threatened, you'll hear from your neighbor. So I actually had to walk around my community before I built my house and ask my neighbors if it would be okay if I built this house. I didn't really ask permission. I just said, hey, I'm going to be doing this, and I need your feedback. And I have to tell you, my neighbors were like, awesome, because that means we're not going to have a honking house next to ours, and we like our view to, whatever the miniature forest is that we have in our little community. And, they were really happy about it. My house is half the value of the house next door and half the value of the house across the street and half the value of the one that's diagonal to it. It has not affected their property values. If anything, theirs have raised mine. And that makes my house more expensive, doesn't it? So in any event, my neighbors are happy with it, but not everybody will be, particularly if we're talking about accessory dwellings and in very tight spaces already. So NIMBYism is a problem for sure. We've seen that in Raleigh already when they were discussing accessory dwelling units, and less so here, I think. But anyway, those are the big challenges in terms of getting houses built. I'd say there are also other internal challenges, like how the code doesn't work very well in terms of how many fire detectors you have to have in your house. I have 3, and they go off all the time. And then there's moisture issues and appraisal value and other things that sort of happen on an individual level. I'd be happy to talk about those if you have questions about them.
We should, first of all, just thank everyone for these presentations. We have a good bit of time for the discussion, but I'd like to first recognize and thank our elected officials, and I hope I don't miss anyone who have come out today. We have from the town of Chapel Hill, our council member Parker here. From Carborough, is Alderman Fouché here? Yes. From our Orange... sorry, Bethany. We've already recognized you. Yeah. And from Orange County Commissioners, we have Commissioner Price, who's here, Commissioner Jacobs, and Commissioner Markopoulos. And McKee. Sorry, didn't see you come in, Earl. All right, thank you. Did I miss anyone?
Yes, Alan Guanci.
Oh, Rachel Shevitz. She snuck in. Sorry, I missed.
And Alan Guanci.
Oh, Alan. Okay, from the town council. 2 other town council members from Chapel Hill. We appreciate you all coming and contributing, but listening to the community conversation about tiny homes. Because clearly, like many places in this state and elsewhere, but we can do something about what's happening here in terms of creating more diversity in housing that will address the needs of our community. So with that, I would like to open it. I want to make a couple of ground rules. I ask that you be brief, whether it's a question or a statement or a viewpoint. We want to have as many people contribute as possible, and we've already had the formal speeches. And always, of course, please be respectful. So with that, I will open up the floor. Who wants to go first? And you might just stand and say your name, and if Julie can get to you with the mic, otherwise shout out.
I'm Robert Krause. I live in Carborough. I've noticed in Carborough there are a lot of rather small homes that can't be more than 400 or 500. And I'm wondering, how do they exist there? Were they just grandfathered in some way? And then I'm increasingly seeing newer stuff that looks like it's well under 1,000 feet, probably 700, 800. So I don't know quite what the limits, but if I could say a little something about I think one of the reasons why Carborough may be more favorable is because there already are a lot of small homes there.
Sorry. Julie, I'm not sure your mic is on.
So Carborough is a mill town, and so historical stock has been either large homes for management or small homes for workers. So there are lots of very small homes. The house I lived in before the one I have now was less than 800 square feet. There are also lots of small homes that were built by some of the farmers in the community and others that had lived there for a long time that built them specifically to serve the student market, and it was their retirement income. There were no 401ks. So you do see them, and it's just that our new zoning and code.
Yeah. I also wanted to add that the town does have an accessory dwelling unit ordinance where you can build small homes now on foundations, tiny homes. There's not a minimum. So that may be why you're seeing those newer ones spring up. So building a small home or a tiny home in Chapel Hill, Carborough, in Orange County isn't a problem. It's if it's on a foundation and it meets the building code.
Question for April and Kimberly. So how did the Flat Rock project specifically get permission? Thank you.
So
how did the Flat Rock project get permission from the state, you said, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
the way that worked. The Village of Wildflowers, in Flat Rock, it's in Henderson County. And I think April mentioned that it was a former mobile home park. Someone bought the park and went to the town and said, I want to build a tiny home community. And they said, well, given the state building code and our local building code, we can't do that. And so they went to the state building code council and petitioned to get an exemption for the site, and they were successful in doing that so that you can have the park models that are on foundations and the tiny homes on wheels, movable tiny homes, both as full-time residents there. And it's a beautiful community. If you have a chance to go, it's absolutely a beautiful community. And they're buying all the land around them because there's so much demand. Every lot is completely full, and they're expanding.
Bethany, you mentioned the cost, but what is the range of cost for hookups for water and sewer? And I don't want to hear about Orange County. Please don't tell me what you're doing over there with well and septic, but basically like with a WASA.
Right. The really wonderful news is that, it used to be that there was a tiered system, and the lowest tier was $3,600 for a hookup. And I believe it was in January, John Morris might be able to speak to this, they reduced the water and sewer hookup rates for all classes of homes, but particularly for homes that are less than 800 square feet, they drastically cut it. I think it's pretty much cut in half, about $1,700. Yes, about $1,700 now, which is still pretty expensive, but it's dang less expensive than it used to be. Other parts of the state. That's a good question, and I don't know that it really varies a lot from community to community.
Another question? What a quiet crowd. How about hop in here? Yes, ma'am. If you'll stand up so we can see you.
I wanted to ask about the Pee Wee homes and how that all came about and who's living there, and is there a specific population, not unlike Penny Farm? So if you can speak to that.
Yeah, so Pee Wee Homes is named after a gentleman named Pee Wee who lives in the town who used to have a house, and he is homeless. And so the three homes will be for people coming out of homelessness. I think they're going to rent for like $250 a month. But yeah, so they're going to house people who are currently homeless on that property.
The crowd next door is really lively.
Is there anybody else from Pee Wee here who could help answer any Pee Wee questions? Yes.
And that's right. We're aiming towards about the median income for rent, and it'll be a sliding rent based on what somebody can pay, but within the range of about 240 to about 350.
Is that true for the North Side neighborhood as well, the duplexes? Okay, awesome.
All right, a question in the back, sir?
Yes, hi. My name is Micah Intrator. I'm a lifelong resident here in Chapel Hill, close to 40 years. So I've seen Chapel Hill change a lot. A lot of my concerns are about affordable housing and how the landscape of our town has changed. And anyone who's lived here for 10 years or more has seen how much it's significantly changed. I think Carborough has kind of held out a little bit more of the village feeling that we've all, moved here or grown up here to love. And this is less of a question and more of just a comment for some of the politicians who've come out, as well as just our community, that what I'd love to see is a way that more communities could be built, not just way out in the sticks, 10 miles out of town, but on a bus route, bikeable, close to town. And the reason communities collectively make more sense is a lot of the things that you mentioned, such as impact fees, sewer hookups. If there was a half a dozen tiny houses on a half an acre right in town, then a community of people could come together and pool the cost of one sewer hookup, etc. So that's just something I wanted to say.
Other comments or viewpoints? Yes, ma'am. Over here. If you stand and Julie will rush you the microphone.
My name is Soteria Shepperson. Last year, I was an intern with the Johnson Service Corps, and it is founded through the Chapel of the Cross. I did my internship with Justice United, the men's shelter here in Chapel Hill, and then I also collaborated with United Church of Chapel Hill. So I've grown to love this place, and I still do a lot of work with the men at the Orange County Men's Prison. And one of the most disheartening things is to see these guys change their life and come out and have nowhere to live. A lot of the people that help us with our groceries, that may fix your meals right here in Chapel Hill, they go right back home to the prison on their own work release, and I think it's this stigma of that everybody wants to be there. I am a proponent of housing first. There's a model, I believe it might have been started in Utah. I would highly recommend everyone to check that out. And the model basically says if you can give someone a safe haven, then they can think about getting a job. Then they can think about taking care of their kids and their mental health. And I am really, really seeing the change about the men who do get their housing. And it's sad, but they're moving to Durham because it's more affordable. So we're losing good people who do want to change their lives. And I don't think going back to prisons should be an option. But there, some of them feel safer because they know they have 3 meals a day. They know who's crazy. They know who's not. They have somewhere to sleep. And I think as enriched as this area is, we really have we have to do more. And the beautiful thing is that we can. And I want you to know a lot of people are relying on you to do more.
Thank you. I just want to say that I believe that there's a meeting going on in Durham about the affordability crisis of housing in Durham. So, yes.
Thanks for raising that. Just today I was in Wilmington visiting Good Shepherd Center, which is a comprehensive homeless services organization. They've just finished building and are going to build a second phase of what's called Lakeside Reserve, and it's permanent supportive housing for people who have experienced homelessness and probably some kind of disability as well, whether it's mental or otherwise. And some are returned citizens, some are just folks that have been on the streets for a long time or just have had a hard time holding down housing. And the housing is supposed to be, is in that 30%. It's 30% or less of AMI. And they're full one-bedroom apartments, and there's 16 units in one congregate building, lots in common space and supportive services. The idea is if you wrap around the supportive services with the living environment but still enable plenty of independent living, folks will do just fine. And they do just fine, but this is my point, that buildings like that have to have a whole lot of subsidy. There's no question about it. In this case, there was donated land from the federal government, and there was significant money from the city through HUD, and then there was state money from the NC Housing Finance Agency, which has a program for building permanent supportive housing. But here's the thing. Those units, if they're state supported, can't be smaller than 600 square feet. Well, that building, that same building could support, you take it, so they did 600 square feet apartments, and those are really nice size apartments. But any of us would be very, very happy to live there. Anybody could live in a 400 square foot apartment. That's what I basically live in, right? My point is that building, if it has 16 units in it now at 600 square feet, take that down to 550. Take it down to 5. How many more units could you put in that building for essentially the same cost, except a few more toilets, a few more appliances, right? But even the state resists this idea that small living is okay.
Other comments? Yes.
Hi, I'm Diana Newton from Carborough. First, a comment and then a question. This may sound unrelated, but hear me out. As a film enthusiast, if any of you want to watch a film called One Big Home, it's about what has happened on Martha's Vineyard up in Massachusetts and the preponderance of massive home building and the impact on the island and the social fabric of life there. So it's kind of the flip side of tiny home living, just to say in affluent communities, overbuilding size-wise, as you all referred to, can really be a problem, and this makes it very real. So it's a documentary last year. Look it up. Secondly, are you aware of anybody who's doing like slow money loans to tiny home prospects?
That's a great question.
Yeah, I know a slow money down in Chatham County, Mark Hewitt's wife, but I don't think I think they're just doing food prep places.
Businesses, right?
Yeah, businesses, but I don't think they're doing homes. But that's a good idea, actually. It's a great idea.
I wanted slow money. Yes.
So slow money is where people basically loan money to businesses to get started, and they have a very low percentage payback, and it's fixed, and so it's a much more affordable loan than a bank would get. Plus, it's like within a community within or a business within their community, so they're actually supporting a local business to get started. It's very successful, actually.
I also wanted to add that in terms of financing that, for example, if you build a tiny home on wheels that is certified by REVA or ANSI, then you can get a bank loan just like you would for an RV. And also insurance. And so that's when we're saying it's really good. If there's some way that we can start institutionalizing this and making it more custom, then all of a sudden banks will start lending. We have to start somewhere, and then the tradition will follow, but we have to start somewhere.
This, in response to the young woman's remarks, and then also to Bethany about NIMBY, it's just me.
I think
it's my phone.
It's your earring.
Oh, maybe.
Your nose ring.
I had an opportunity, as mentioned in the bio, a few years ago. I worked on the Chapel Hill Master Plan, and I had attended a lot of the workshops on the diversity and the arts, and sort of every single thing about the Chapel Hill Master Plan comes back to the same thing, and it's land use. Like whether it was transit was a focus group, it was land use. Who's going to put a bus station somewhere? Or whether it was diversity in the arts. Well, if you want artists, you need affordable housing because they're not going to live here and they're not in it for the money. And if you want, so it's like all 6 of the focus areas, one of which was actually land use, were all really about land use. And there was like a fist fight that broke out about the rural buffer. I mean, people get real worked up about this kind of stuff, particularly if it means their property value is going to go down. So, but the thing that I thought then, and I think now more than anything is it's sort of like it's sort of like when you say like, oh, the plane crashed because the wings fell off. It's like, well, that's why it crashed, but why did the wings fall off? You know, the idea is we can live in small spaces. Like, it's not hard. Like, people are already doing it. But the will has to be there. And the question about why the will is or isn't there a lot of times comes down to, well, let's say you want to have houses that are $20,000 builds or $30,000 builds. The people that can only afford that, do you want them in your community? I mean, that's really the question. And it just comes down to, like, the people who are service workers or who only make a certain amount of money. The reason that these factors and these perverse incentives exist is precisely to price them out of the market. Like, I mean, that's the real reason. So the question is, all of this can be done. These problems are solved. Like, they're easily solvable. But what kind of communities do we want? Do we want diverse, inclusive communities where it's both age and gender and lifestyle and income, or do we not? And if we do, then we can make it happen. It's not that hard to do. So the question that I want to bring it back to is, what kind of communities, you know, whether it's on transit lines, whether it's walkable, whether it's low impact, do you really want to work next to somebody who just came, or live next to somebody who just got out of jail and maybe has a felony record or something like I have to ask myself the same question: do I want to live next to somebody? And I live in 160 square feet. I mean, it's something that I struggle with a lot, and I think that the conversation doesn't have real legs unless we start with the question of what kind of community do we want, and then work backwards from there. And the rest, these regulations and building code and residential zoning, that's just like rounding error. Like, we can solve that.
The people I know who are really struggling are single mothers who have several children. And I just wondered if I understand tiny homes aren't the right thing for them, but they seem to be having the toughest time in this area, and I just wondered if anybody could address that.
I think that, I guess one thing that we want to say is that we know that small homes are small and tiny homes are tiny, and they're not made for everyone. I mean, it might be a single person, a couple with one child, but, you know, a large family, that would be really difficult unless we have seen in some areas where they put two tiny homes together. But there are other affordable options for larger families, and they could be modular homes or mobile homes. So we're saying that tiny homes aren't the answer for everyone for affordable housing, but it can be the answer for some. Yeah.
Did you want to speak? Hi there.
Hey, I'm Amelia. I'm from Carborough. Carborough. I'm from Carborough, Amelia. And I'm a single mom, and one of the things I was wondering about is the RV law, because there are tiny homes certified RV builders. And I don't know if there's like a park that could be grandfathered in. And I know tiny homes don't like to be associated with RVs or HUD, but they are. And it's not a mobile home, and it's not an RV. It's a very high-quality home. And it's affordable, but our Carborough doesn't allow RVs to be resided in for more than 180 days. And I kind of looked at that like, oh, what does reside mean? 180 days. So, like, do I leave for a week and then come back? Who's watching me? Who's actually paying attention to how many times I leave out my front door? And so it was like, oh, I could ask for forgiveness and do it anyway, but Carborough's so small, everybody drives by, everybody knows. So that's, something that spins around in my head often is if we didn't have the RV thing, how much problem would it really pose to the community? So
that's a great question, and I think that the woman who was suggesting that, having communities, or maybe it was a man, anyway, some folks have spoken to having small, tiny home communities that are specifically designed around this issue, or that are mindful of this issue, that enable a sense of community, or create community, are part of the fabric of the community. Could help reduce the barriers I think that people have against the idea of someone having an RV parked in their neighbor's driveway, which is what the problem is, right? And the second problem is that we don't have any RV parks zoned in Carborough. Now, we could do that. And in fact, one of my ideas has been to have two side by side. And every 180 days, you just switch the one that you just move, right? And you have like one common place for all the mailboxes, and but who's gonna? I mean, HUD's, what's HUD gonna do? So that would be one way to get around. But then there's a process for that, right? But we could do it. I think that you're absolutely right.
I also want to say that in our conversations with county staff and other folks across the state who are looking at this, it's pretty clear that different counties regulate RV parks in different ways. There are clearly people who are living full-time in RV parks in the state. And different codes are written differently. Some codes, I guess, like Orange County, not only have RV kind of regulations, but they have zoning and planning regulations and other regulations overlaid. And different counties regulate things differently. And that's why we're saying, let's look at what other communities are doing and see, is there some flexibility that we can gain that would allow it to happen legally here, because there are clearly people living full-time in RV parks and RVs, and even people living in movable tiny homes in RV parks full-time here in North Carolina.
I want to switch just a moment because most of what your comments or questions have been more favorable, and I want to hear from anyone here who feels that they really have serious reservations or concerns, whether it's the cost per square foot or what. What are some of the issues that we haven't yet heard from anyone on? Yes, ma'am.
So my concern is when you start taking people in their living situations and bringing them closer and closer together, you start running into personal problems such as sound. What types of things have you found? You're talking about clusters of tiny houses where everybody's kind of on the same wavelength and then having clusters of those. But have you thought about these types of things and what that might be like?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and since we have a lot of communities that are really close together, like Southern Village, for instance, I mean, I'm sure there's sound over there, so I don't really see how it would be any different than any other small knit community. I mean, my vision would be for the town to buy out one of our mobile home parks and just transform it into, a place with larger mobile homes that are more energy efficient for families and tiny homes. I mean, it just would be, for me, an amazing thing to see. And we could have the students actually help build the tiny homes. They learn how, building. I mean, it would be amazing. So, yeah, I mean, I think the noise would just be like, like Acadia. I mean, Acadia, we could have a tiny home, Acadia or Pacifica. I mean, that would be amazing to me.
Julie, while you're walking back there, I just want to say I know that some people do wonder, will this lower property values? And we have researched that, and what we found is that there's no evidence that accessory dwelling units do lower property values, and that where you are in areas that are highly popular, like Chapel Hill, Carborough, Orange County, they in fact raise property values because of the income generating potential. So I just wanted to, I do know that can be a fear. I mean, people do care about their property values, but we haven't found any evidence that they do lower property values.
My name is Nancy, and that's a perfect setup to my comment. And I was wondering if there was ever a discussion about giving tax breaks to big honking properties that allowed a tiny home on their property. And a better tax break if it's a teacher or a first responder or a whatever. And I think that could be easily tracked and an appealing thing where the tax burden is high.
That's a great idea. The problem is in North Carolina, local governments don't have the authority from the state to change, to offer tax incentives in that way, to futz with property tax incentives or credits or whatever. We have to have permission from the state to do that. Orange County is not getting permission from the state to do anything ever again until we change the color of that, of blue, from red to blue. That's just, it's not ever going to happen. Yeah.
I also think, I'm Debbie. I live in Carborough. I've also been to the Village of Wildflowers 8 times over the past 2 years. So the first time I went, I guess a year ago, June, there were only about a half dozen homes there. And this past October, they're pretty filled up. They only had like a few lots. They are going to purchase more land. One side they can't. But I think there's a benefit because there are year-rounders. I know of one family with 2 young children living in a 240 square foot tiny home. So it can be done for them. He works at Trader Joe's in Asheville and allows the mother to stay home with the 2 kids, both under 5, one under 1. And I think the community feel is good. We come from, and I rent, but one of the people who bought a resale home is a retired superintendent from Greenville, and the wife works at Department of Public Instruction. You have folks from all over the country, and I think that mixed SES and everything else makes for a really good time. They also now have their board of directors. They're making their own decisions, and it's a wonderful community. I have a lot of friends there, and we have bonfires at night and cover dishes, and it's safe. So I get it that for a teacher, being a teacher, that'd be a great option. But the community in itself and having neighbors, and yes, they have a noise ordinance from 8 p.m. till about 10 in the morning. So,
in wrapping up, I want to mention again, there is the petition for anyone who's interested in signing it that April and Kimberly's group will be presenting to the Chapel Hill Town Council this Wednesday. I would also urge that if you're interested in this issue, and particularly around creating more diverse housing, that you get in touch with Kimberly, with April, or with Susan from Habitat. And there is always the responsibility to contact your elected officials in the county, in your town, and in the state. And please, please, folks, go and vote. Vote. That's what makes the difference. All right. Now, a round of applause for all of this really excellent information.